About 10 years ago, I saw a well-dressed woman who was maybe about 30-ish with a pit bull hitchhiking on a slow country road. My friend Bill asked me to pick her up. I hesitated, but pulled over anyway and picked her up. She was going to the town I lived at about 20 miles away. I told her that I was going there, and it would be easy to just drop her off. She was pleasant enough, and we were all talking about the day. I eventually dropped my friend off at his house, and we continued to drive home another 10 miles. When we got on the highway again, I looked back in my rearview mirror, and she was putting a needle in her arm. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, but I just looked ahead. Within 2 minutes of that, she said she knows what I want, and that her big dog could kill me if I laid a finger on her. I just looked back at her and asked what she was talking about. She then flipped out and started screaming at me not to touch her. Of course, I was a little freaked out at that point, and told her she could get out of my car and pulled over. But she wouldn't get out and told me she was sorry. I got back on the road, and within 5 minutes she was telling her dog to watch me, and how her dog would kill me. I was close to home, so I just kept driving, and I asked her where she was going to. She then proceeded to tell me that I wasn't going to get in her pants, and that was the last thing on my mind. I wasn't really afraid of the dog, but she was freaking scary, and had blood running down her arm, wiping it on her shirt. She told me where to turn and what house to go to. I pulled in, and she immediately got out of the car. I got out to get her backpack out of my car too, and she just ran inside the house. The woman said that she was her mom, and I handed her the pack that was in my trunk. She told me that her daughter was mentally ill and she hasn't seen her in weeks. That was the last time I ever picked up a hitchhiker. So, this was told to me by an old family friend, Nikki, numerous times as a kid growing up, as one of those, quote, life advice stories, to keep in mind through the years, and to her credit, I've never forgotten it. Whenever anything associated with hitchhiking comes up, it always springs to my mind and probably always will. It makes me a bit ill whenever I think about it, actually. So Nikki, who grew up at the same time as my dad around the early 80s, was a young woman in her mid-20s. She's one of those real kind-hearted souls, always willing to help out another in their time of need, you know? And I can't imagine her being anything other than that when she was younger, so I totally see her doing this too. So, driving into the city, about a 2-hour or so drive from town, she saw a man walking down the side of the road. As she neared him, he turned and, in typical hitchhiker manner, stuck out the old arm and thumb. Nikki, bless her heart, pulled over and asked him if he needed any help. She told me that he was really polite, if not a bit shy, when he asked for a lift into the city. Nikki gave a smile and popped open the passenger door for the guy, who tossed his bag into the back seat and buckled up for the ride ahead. They talked pleasantly for most of the trip, about friends, the news, etc. She felt that they were getting along really well, and even bought him dinner at the pit stop a little over halfway there. She said he seemed really flustered and awkward when she paid, but one of the things they had talked about was money, and how he was pretty dang strapped for cash, which is why he was hitchhiking in the first place. But he eventually relented, and they went on their way. As soon as they got into the city, he thanked her profusely for the ride and the food, and asked to be dropped off once they hit downtown. Before getting out though, he asked for Nikki's phone number so he could contact her someday and catch up. Thrilled at the prospect of knowing how her new friend was faring, Nikki wrote it down for him and drove off with the warm feeling of a good deed done. Now, I'm sorry if you were expecting something creepy to have happened by now, but I think this is what freaked me out so much as a kid. How nice everything seemed to have worked out. Nikki would get this crease in her forehead and a funny look in her eye when she would tell me this next part. A week later, she got a phone call from her driving buddy. He didn't let her get in a word in edgewise after hello, and told her that she should thank God that she was raised so nice, because when he first got in the car, he was already planning on raping and murdering her once they got to that pit stop. That he was going to steal that car and dump her body in a ditch further down the road and go on his merry way. But after she talked to him so kindly, and treated him to dinner with a smile on her face, he couldn't bring himself to do it. He didn't think that he could live with himself after doing that to such a nice lady. And to please, Nikki, please, never ever pick up another hitchhiker. Then he hung up the phone. Nikki never got a call from him again, and when she tried redialing the number, all she got was a payphone. And so, Mr. Hitchhiker, I know I'm never going to meet you, because I'm going to listen to the advice you gave your driving buddy and never ever pick up a hitchhiker. The story took place 2 years ago. I was on my second week backpacking through Austria, and I reached a point where I was too exhausted to walk any longer. It was an unusually hot day, I had blisters all over my feet, and I was ready to call it quits. I was in the middle of nowhere, and I decided to thumb a lift to the nearest train station. But I was out of luck. I stood there for what felt like hours, and no car would pick me up. I don't blame them, I spent 2 weeks sleeping in the woods, my clothes were dirty, and I probably looked like a maniac. When finally a truck pulled up, and I didn't hesitate to hop inside, because I was so thankful to be able to sit down and rest my feet for a while. I asked the driver if he could drop me off at the nearest train station so that I could catch a train to Vienna, but he told me that he was heading back that way anyway, and that he could take me there as long as I didn't mind him making a stopover to load the truck. I didn't, and so we drove along. We made some small talk, and he seemed to be very polite. It was a pretty enjoyable ride until we reached the first stop. He loaded his truck while I walked around a bit and bought some water at a gas station nearby. He had offered me drinks a few times along the ride, but I always declined because I don't feel comfortable with something like that. I got back in the truck and we continued the drive to Vienna. Almost immediately after we took off again, he told me that it wouldn't be a problem for him if I wanted to take off some of my clothes since it was such a hot day. I told him that it was fine, but he brought it up a couple more times. He also asked me if I wanted to take a nap in the back, and then he had several hitchhikers sleeping there in the past. I declined and started to feel a little uneasy around him, and planned to leave the truck at the next gas stop. All of a sudden, he nearly yelled at me to put my head down and to hide, because he was driving past his stepfather's car, and he didn't want him to see me in the truck. That struck me as really odd, but I did it anyway because his yelling took me by surprise. That confirmed my resolution to get out of there as soon as possible, and I asked him to drop me off at the next stop and made up some excuse that it was my goal to enter Vienna by foot and that I rested enough to make it, thanks to his lift. He agreed, and I got my stuff ready. He suddenly turned to me and said that I looked familiar, and that he was sure he had seen me somewhere before. I shrugged it off, but he insisted that he remembered my face. He asked me if I ever went to a swingers club, because he was sure he saw me there sometime. That caught me really off guard, and I told him that that was impossible because I had never been to one before. "Well, do you want to? I'm going to one in Vienna. Let's go there together. I'm sure you'll like it." At this point, I really wanted to get off that truck as soon as possible, and told him that I had no intention to come with him and asked him to drop me off now. He didn't answer, but instead reached into his pants and started masturbating as he drove along. I completely froze up. I kept thinking that I'd jump off as soon as he stopped somewhere, and tried to ignore what he was doing since he didn't respond to my plea to let me out. A gas station was coming up and he stopped what he was doing and asked if we should take a shower together. I figured that there would be people around and that would make it easier to get rid of him, so I told him sure, why not. He pulled up, and as soon as he stopped, I yanked open the door to run across the parking lot area of the gas station, hoping that he wouldn't come after me. He didn't, so I just kept running until the gas station was out of sight and I reached a busy street. Only after my heart stopped racing and I caught my breath, I realized that I left my shoes at the truck. I walked the last few kilometers barefoot, and I kept a lookout for the truck until I reached Vienna. This is a story that comes from my father's experience as a hitchhiker. During the late 60s and 70s, when he was between 13 and 16 years old, my father took off for the summer and went on a big road trip around northeast Quebec. Apparently, his parents didn't care about him. Anyway, as he's going along, he gets picked up by a bunch of Americans that are heading up the same way. I can't recall if these guys were drift dodgers or vets, but either way it became pretty clear to him that these guys weren't completely sane. Not wanting to draw their attention to this fact, he figured that he would take the ride and ditch them as soon as possible. That first night, they end up in some sort of RV campground. While setting up their stuff, one of the rangers comes over and starts to give them trouble. Either they hadn't paid their fees or didn't want to pay or whatever. After a little while, the ranger leaves and the Americans are really bothered by this guy. Rather than addressing the issue, they start putting together a plan to off this guy. They'd apparently brought some rifles across the border and thought it would be easier to kill the ranger than to be hassled about fees. My dad is generally a calm guy, but when he realized what was going on and that these guys would not be talked out of it, he was thinking, what am I getting myself into? The next time the ranger comes back, my dad approaches him right away and tells him that he's got to go. I'm not sure if he paid the guy or just warned him, but either way, the ranger left and didn't come back. The craziest part of this story, in my opinion, is that he stayed with those guys for a few more days. Rather than piece the heck out like most people would do, they kept him on with them. He probably saved that ranger's life, and also saved himself from a much worse fate. The most memorable year of my life, age 17, senior year of high school, 1979. My buddy and I, on a whim, as usual, decided to go camping in North Jersey at a place called the Caves. We used to crawl through the caves, me scared it would collapse, but always did it anyway. We camped there a lot, with up to 20 friends at a time. By the way, this cave is sealed now due to a few deaths after our years. Anyway, that whim was at dusk. We walked 5 miles to Interstate 287 North Ramp and started hitchhiking. We screwed up not looking at the weather, and it started to pour. This old white car pulled over, and 2 old guys that look like me now were in it. They seemed nice enough. They said for some gas they'd take us right there to Round Valley where the caves are. I don't know, but I had a sixth sense then that this ain't right. No bad clues or anything, but we looked at each other after about 10 minutes and said that they could drop us off here. They said, "Are you sure? It's pouring out." But no problem, they stopped and let us out anyway. A week later, I'm reading the newspaper and an article said that they caught 2 revolutionaries at their farm in Pennsylvania, close enough to the caves. Their pictures were in the paper along with their wives. Wouldn't you know it, they were the guys who picked us up. I even had my friend verify it was them. Damn, like, you never know. Maybe they wanted to indoctrinate us or something if we took that full ride. But it was exciting that every friend in high school started to call us lucky. One of them was even wanted for murdering a cop. Scary shit after that fact. I never hitchhiked again. Oh man, I've got a few. Most are humorous, cute, or banal, but I've had some bad ones too. But I'll boil them down to the worst couple. These 2 instances are also the only times I've called the police in my life, because what they were doing was so dangerous and I couldn't think of another solution at the time. Both of my bad stories emerged from getting picked up by rig pigs. A great many years back, I'm on the side of the road with my thumb out, waiting for a ride. This gent with a massive rig rocket pulls over and yell grunts at me to get the fuck in. I put my head in the window and tell him where I'm going, and more empathetically, he kicks his door open and orders me to get the fuck in. My better judgment notwithstanding, I do get the fuck in. He notes that if anyone ever tries to steal his truck, he'd stab them in the fucking heart. While availing me of this information, he proceeds to pull out a big fucking knife and make a stabbing motion at my, quote, fucking heart. This gentleman then shoves his hand into the back of his truck and in one swift motion opens 2 beers and gave one to me. He pounded beers all the way to my stop, chucking them through the truck window into the back into his box. Another time, again, many years ago, a guy picked me up. He noted that if anyone ever tried to steal his truck, he'd, quote, swerve into traffic and kill us both. And while doing so, fake swerved into traffic. So after making small talk, he asked me to grab the wheel while he, quote, lights up a smoke. He grabs a piece of glass and a straw and smokes meth while I'm holding the wheel. Then the fucker is like, "Oh shit, how rude, you want a blast?" I politely decline and get out at the next stop. Man, those 2 guys really made me miss the pot-smoking storytelling type of folks. But I hitchhiked a lot, and those are my only 2 bad stories. I hitchhiked many years ago, almost all between the years of 1976 and 1978. I was in my early 20s. I got hit on a lot, and at least the impression was that I was a woman of extremely easy virtue. I wasn't. Generally though, people were really nice. My worst ride was in Iowa. It was at nighttime. I was heading from Des Moines to Kansas City for a wedding. I had only a short time to get there. A truck driver stops and picks me up, and after about 15 minutes or so, he made a pass and locked the doors. I said no. He pulled over and got more and more aggressive and violent. I got more adamant and less polite. He told me I better play nice or he'd kill me and leave my body in the surrounding cornfields, but I refused. He, finally tired of me, especially when I wouldn't stop screaming, dumped me in the surrounding Iowa cornfields. It was about 11 p.m., I think. I was terrified, particularly that he might come back with a gun or backup, or my imagination ran wild. I walked for hours hiding in the cornfields when I finally heard a vehicle approach. About 6 a.m., I started hitchhiking again. I couldn't be late for that wedding. I made it with time to spare. I remembered that night for a long time, but life happens and I sort of forgot about the story until tonight. I still remember how terrified I was, though. Oddly, I was even more terrified after he left. More time to worry, more time for my imagination to run wild. And I was afraid he wouldn't quite kill me, and I'd have to tell my father what happened. I was afraid of that even more. I've hitched a very few times since then, maybe 4 more times. It's great fun, but I was really afraid of dying that night, and what my father would say, so young. I was once hitchhiking in Pennsylvania. On this day, it was raining rather heavily, and I was wearing shorts and short sleeves, as it wasn't raining the day before. This car pulled over, and a female driver along with 3 other passengers looked at me. They asked me where I was off to, and I told them my destination was Ohio, but I told them that the state border would be okay, as I noticed a government-issued tracker on one of their ankles, aka they may be on parole. The driver said that she had to pull for gas. We pulled into a gas station and the driver gets out and starts pumping the gas. Then she opens the trunk. I heard a conversation between her and a male voice. I heard him saying, "Let go of me, you creep." Then I heard gunfire. The other girls in the car just sat there as if everything was normal. Then the trunk closed. The girl went back to the pump and finished up. She got in the car and we continued driving. Meanwhile, I looked back and saw a guy on the ground bleeding. We pulled over, and this time the driver said she had business to take care of. We were on the side of the road near a wooded area. All the other girls got off as well. The trunk opened again, and I saw a shovel come out, as well as a black bag. Something in the bag was moving. Then they disappeared into the woods. 2 hours later, they came back, and we headed back along our way. We then pulled into a dirt road into the woods. The driver parked the car. She turned around and looked me straight in the eye. She said to me, "You're next." I got out of the car and bolted. I found myself near the state border, and I got another ride. This time it was a cab driver. I arrived at my destination, and from that point forth on my trip, I always arranged for a cab. Not my story, but my dad's. He was traveling through Arizona on his way to Mexico. He looked to the side of the road and saw a man hitchhiking. My dad pulled over and asked where the guy was going, to which the man said, "The next town over." My dad, being a very trusting man, and this being in the 70s or 80s, decided he would give him a ride. While they were driving, they started talking, and my father asked for his name. His name was Derp. My dad, quite shocked, looked at him and said, "Holy crap, that's my name." They had a few other small conversations, and at the next town over, my dad let him out and continued to Mexico. He eventually reached the border, and as he pulled up, the border official asked to see his license. He took a good long look at that license. The official then took off his big aviator sunglasses and told him to pull over to the side. My dad got out of the car and they put him in a room while they searched his car. He was sitting in that room for a good few hours, admiring the entire wall of confiscated tequila, when the officer walked back in and apologized for the wait. My dad asked him what the reason was, and the officer replied, "There's a warrant out for the arrest of Derp." Once again dazed, my dad asked, "What for?" The officer replied, "Murder." My dad damn near crapped his pants. I wasn't the one hitchhiking. Actually, this was when I picked up a couple of teenagers hitchhiking themselves. It was in Memphis, Tennessee in the 1960s. A buddy and I were riding home around midnight when we saw these 2 guys hitchhiking and picked them up. We had the usual brief chit-chat, and I had driven a mile or so with them in the back seat when I heard a familiar, to me, sound of a switchblade knife clicking open, and I felt the blade press against the right side of my neck. This was not a good feeling. "This is a holdup," the one behind me announced. "Pass your money over to my buddy here." My friend beside me reached into his pocket and pulled out a Saturday Night Special, a cheap .22 caliber revolver, and casually pointed it over his shoulder and said, "Yeah, it's a holdup all right, but you guys are the ones getting held up. Now drop the knife over the seat. Pass whatever else you've got over there too." My heart was pounding. They begged it off with, "Oh hey, we were just kidding," and "We ain't got nothing. Why do you think we were trying to rob you?" My buddy wasn't satisfied. "Drive downtown to the police station," he told me. "And you guys, start stripping down to your underwear and push your clothes over the seat. Now." We dropped them off in front of the Memphis PD headquarters in their tidy-whities and laughed long. We donated their clothes in a charity box along the way home.